Hours dragged on, each minute an eternity of agony. The sun climbed, merciless, and the woman felt life draining away, her skin burning, her mind clouded. It was then that a different shadow, immense and majestic, began to stretch over her. A deep roar, which should have inspired terror, resonated, but it was not one of attack. A lion with a golden mane and piercing eyes approached slowly. It was not a hungry predator, but a force of nature that seemed to recognize the fragility before it. With surprising calm, the king of the desert lay down beside the chained woman, positioning his massive body to create a barrier against the sun's cruelest rays. The lion's shadow, warm and alive, covered the woman, protecting her from burns and deadly heat, an unexpected guardian in an act of wild compassion that brutally contrasted with human coldness. The lion's shadow was not just physical relief, it was a balm for her torn soul. The woman, who moments before had accepted death as a liberation, felt an electric shock run through her body. Her clouded eyes, almost blind from the relentless light, tried to focus on the golden, living mass that now protected her. It was not delirium, not the final mirage of an exhausted mind. It was real. The unbearable heat on her skin receded a little, replaced by a milder temperature beneath the feline's dense fur. The smell of earth, sweat, and death that enveloped her was overcome by the wild, clean scent of the lion, a smell of life, of primordial strength. She dared not move, nor even breathe deeply. Every fiber of her being screamed in alert, but the lion remained motionless, its breath deep and rhythmic, a slow, constant drum against the oppressive silence of the desert. She could feel the residual warmth of the animal's body, a different protective warmth, not the scorching, murderous heat of the sun. Her eyes, previously fixed on the relentless sky, now observed the majestic mane, the broad back that rose like a golden mountain, the flank that rose and fell with each breath. It was a sight that defied all logic, all the cruelty that had brought her to this point. An animal, the most feared of predators, offering refuge where her own blood had offered only condemnation. The following hours were a macabre dance between agony and disbelief. Thirst continued to tear at her throat, hunger gnawed at her stomach, and the chains cut into her flesh. But the immediate threat, the unbearable burning that promised a slow, painful death by hypothermia, had been mitigated. The lion did not move. It remained there, a silent guardian, a monument of wild compassion. The woman, in her weakness, began to cry, dry, salty tears streaming down her temples, not from pain, but from overwhelming confusion, from a tenuous thread of hope that refused to be cut. The elderly woman's mind, oscillating between lucidity and delirium, began to fill the space with memories. Her son's face, once a smiling boy in her arms, now distorted by greed and contempt. The cruel words, the cold gaze, the ease with which he abandoned her to the elements. And now, a lion, a creature of wild nature, without reason, without morals, without blood ties, displayed a humanity that her own son had lost. The irony was a bitter poison, but also a strange antidote to absolute despair. The sun continued its relentless trajectory, and the lion's shadow stretched and shrank, but always covered the woman. Small desert insects, previously attracted by her vulnerability, kept their distance, respecting the king's imposing presence. The air, though still hot, seemed less dense, less suffocating under the feline's protection. The woman felt a strange, almost telepathic connection with the animal. There was no fear now, only a silent reverence and a gratitude that transcended words. She watched the tip of the lion's tail, which occasionally moved gently, swatting away a fly, and thought about the fragility of life, the unpredictability of fate. At dusk, as the sun began to descend on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of fire and blood, the lion finally moved. The woman felt a chilling panic, a primitive fear of being exposed again, of having her only refuge withdrawn. But the lion merely stretched, a slow, powerful movement that made its muscles ripple under its golden hide. It let out a silent yawn, revealing sharp teeth, and then, with a last deep look into her eyes, it stood up. The shadow was gone, and the setting sun, though less intense, still hit her with residual heat. The lion walked a few steps, turned, and without a roar, without a warning, disappeared into the orange vastness of the desert, leaving the woman alone again, but no longer the same. The protection was gone, but the hope, the spark of life that the king of the desert had rekindled, remained, and with it the certainty that human cruelty could be overcome by the most unexpected compassion. Night approached, bringing with it other dangers, but for the first time in a long time, the woman felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she could survive. The orange vastness of the desert swallowed the lion, taking with it the protective shadow and the residual warmth of its body. The sun, now a dying ember on the horizon, still cast a final cruel farewell kiss upon the woman's skin, a reminder of her vulnerability. The momentary relief gave way to renewed panic, a chill that came not only from the abrupt drop in temperature, but from the loneliness that enveloped her like a shroud. Night arrived, not as a gentle veil, but as a heavy, dark curtain, promising a new round of torments. The desert, which during the day was a silent furnace, now transformed into a stage for a symphony of strange and menacing sounds. The wind, previously a muffled breath, now howled between the rocks, carrying whispers of danger. The night's cold descended rapidly, biting the woman's exposed skin, which had previously burned under the sun. Every inch of her body, exhausted and battered, trembled uncontrollably. The chains, previously hot and almost fused to her flesh, now turned icy, intensifying the pain and the feeling of imprisonment. Hope, ignited by the lion's unexpected compassion, struggled to survive against the growing darkness and the return of despair. Her eyes, now more accustomed to the gloom, scanned the horizon, searching for any sign, any trace of the majestic figure that had saved her. But there was nothing, only the indifferent immensity, dotted by the first stars that began to appear, cold and distant, like diamonds set in black velvet. The thirst, which had been temporarily overshadowed by the threat of hypothermia, returned with full force, tearing at her throat, transforming her mouth into an even drier desert. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a dull, constant ache that added to the physical torment. But more than the physical pain, it was the pain of the soul that tore at her. The image of her son, now a spectre of cruelty, contrasted brutally with the vivid memory of the lion, the wild king who had offered protection where her own blood had offered only death. The irony was a poison that mingled with her blood, but also a strange force that kept her from giving up. If an animal could show such compassion, perhaps there was a reason for her to fight, even if it was just to challenge the death that surrounded her. Suddenly, a sound. A subtle rustling in the sand not far away. Her senses, sharpened by the proximity of death, went into maximum alert. It was not the lion's deep, protective roar. It was something smaller, more furtive, more insidious. Her eyes tried to penetrate the darkness, but her already weak vision was useless. The sound repeated, closer, a rustle, a smell. The smell of carrion, of something dragging itself in the darkness, attracted by weakness, by vulnerability. A chill ran down her spine. Hyenas, jackals, or something even worse, a snake, a scorpion. The night desert was a realm of predators and opportunists, and she was the perfect prey, immobilized, defenseless. The woman's heart pounded erratically, a frantic drum against her ribs. The fear that the lion had driven away now returned with renewed ferocity, colder and more penetrating than the night air itself. She tried to curl up, but the chains prevented her, keeping her stretched out, exposed. With every sound, every whisper of the wind, she imagined bright eyes in the darkness, sharp teeth, claws ready to strike. The day's protection had been a truce, not salvation. The struggle for survival was far from over. The rustling in the sand ceased for a moment, followed by an oppressive silence that was almost worse than the sound. It was the pause before the attack, the predator's calculating weight. The woman closed her eyes, but the images of teeth and claws were already etched in her mind. She could feel the presence, the warm breath of some hungry animal approaching. Hope, so arduously rekindled, threatened to extinguish again, swallowed by the darkness and primordial terror. The night was long, and she was alone, at the mercy of the demons the desert held in its shadows. The oppressive silence of the desert, which had swallowed her after the lion's departure, was broken by a subtle rustling in the sand, followed by a low growl, almost a guttural whisper, that seemed to come from all directions. The smell of carrion, previously faint, intensified, mingling with the sweet, metallic odor of dried blood that she already exuded from her own wounds. It was not a single predator. There were several. Bright eyes, like embers in the darkness, began to emerge from the gloom, forming a semicircle around her. They were not the majestic, protective eyes of the lion, but cunning, hungry orbs, reflecting the faint light of the first stars. Jackals, hyenas, the distinction mattered little. They were death, creeping in the shadows, waiting. A dry scream tried to tear from her throat, but only a hoarse, desperate gasp escaped. The icy panic that had invaded her transformed into paralyzing terror. She tried to shrink back, to retreat, but the chains held her stretched out, a helpless offering on the cold sand. The night's cold, which had previously made her tremble uncontrollably, now seemed a relief compared to the feverish heat of the fear that consumed her. Her muscles contracted, tense, ready for a fight she knew was useless, but which her survival instinct still demanded. The animals, small and slender, with pointed snouts and erect ears, moved with sinister caution. They did not advance, did not attack. They merely circled, their steps light on the sand, their growls low and intermittent, like a macabre lullaby announcing the end. They were patient, accustomed to waiting for life to completely drain away before claiming their share. It was psychological torture, the certainty that death would not come quickly, but would be a slow process of disintegration, observed by hungry eyes that seemed to mock her helplessness. The elderly woman's mind, already on the verge of collapse, clung to fragments of sanity. Where was the lion now? That unexpected guardian who had offered shade and a brief respite of compassion. He had left, taking hope with him, leaving her at the mercy of the true face of the night desert. Her son's cruelty, who had chained her under the sun to die of heat, now seemed an anticipation of nature's cruelty, which delivered her to its scavengers. The irony was a poison that mingled with her blood, but also a strange force that kept her from giving up completely. If an animal could show such compassion, perhaps there was a reason for her to fight, even if it was just to defy the death that surrounded her. The cold penetrated her bones, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. Thirst was a burning ember in her throat, turning her mouth into an even drier desert, and hunger, a dull, constant ache that gnawed at her stomach. But the worst, more than the physical pain, was the feeling of being watched, of being evaluated as a piece of meat. Her life hanging by a thin thread, about to be cut by sharp teeth. She could feel the warm, fetid breath of the animals as they approached, their wild, dirty smells overpowering the clean, powerful aroma of the lion that still lingered in her memory, a brutal contrast between life and death. One of the jackals, the largest and apparently the leader of the group, stepped forward, its head low, sniffing the air with a slow and calculated movement. Its eyes met hers, and for an instant the woman felt a cold, calculating intelligence behind the primordial hunger. It approached closer, dragging its paws in the sand, the sound amplified in the oppressive silence of the night. She could see its pink, moist tongue, its yellowed, sharp teeth ready to tear. It was so close that she could feel the warmth of its body, a different warmth than the sun, a predator's warmth that announced the end. The jackal approached even closer, its snout almost touching the sand beside her chained hand. It did not bite her, did not attack her. Instead, it began to sniff the chain, then the sand around it, as if inspecting the trap, assessing the prey. Its eyes did not leave hers, a silent communication of dominance and expectation. It was a display of power, a cruel reminder of her helplessness. The woman held her breath, each heartbeat echoing in her ears, a frantic drum against her ribs. She could feel the ground tremble under the animal's light weight, the vibration of its quick, shallow breaths. The other jackals, emboldened by the leader's audacity, began to approach as well, forming a tighter circle. Their growls became more audible, a chorus of impatience and hunger that surrounded her on all sides. They were waiting, not for a direct, quick attack, but for the prey's final collapse, for the moment when life would completely drain away, leaving her at the mercy of their teeth and claws. Amidst the overwhelming terror, a small flame of fury ignited within the woman. She would not die like this. She would not be consumed by these scavengers, not after having been saved by the king of the desert. An unexpected force, fueled by rage and desperation, coursed through her veins, a last flicker of dignity. She opened her mouth and a sound came out, not a cry of fear, but a hoarse, primitive roar, a challenge to the death that surrounded her. It was a sound that came from the depths of her soul, a human roar against relentless savagery. The jackals recoiled a step, surprised by the unexpected outburst. The leader, who was closest, raised its head, its eyes fixed on hers, assessing the new and strange threat. That sound, though weak and hoarse, was not the sound of a dying prey accepting its fate. It was the sound of a struggle, of a will to live that refused to be silenced. They were not accustomed to this. Their prey usually surrendered to fear, to weakness, to inevitability. The night was long, and the demons of the desert still surrounded her, sniffing out death, waiting. But the woman, chained and on the verge of death, had found a voice, a last remnant of dignity. The battle for survival was far from over, and the desert, in its brutal indifference, watched. Hope, though fragile as the sand beneath her feet, had not been extinguished. She trembled with cold, with pain, with fear, but also with a new and strange determination. The night desert was a realm of predators, but she, for a brief moment, had refused to be merely prey. The hoarse roar, more a primal grunt than a scream, echoed in the silent vastness of the night desert. It was not the sound of prey accepting its fate, but of a soul refusing to be silenced. The jackals, accustomed to the weak whimper and resigned silence of impending death, recoiled a step, their bright eyes blinking in the darkness. The leader, the closest, raised its head, its erect ears swiveling, assessing the strange and unexpected manifestation of life. This woman, chained and on the verge of the end, had found a voice, a last remnant of dignity that defied the logic of the food chain. The animal's surprise was momentary, a pause in the macabre dance of death. They were not easily frightened prey. Hunger, a force older and more relentless than fear, soon drove them forward again. The growls, which had ceased for an instant, returned, lower, more menacing, a guttural chorus that seemed to come from within the very sand. They began to circle again, their steps light and furtive, but now with a new caution, a morbid curiosity about this prey that refused to die in silence. The woman, exhausted and trembling, felt the impact of her own voice reverberate in her chest. It was a weak sound, but it was hers. It was proof that despite everything, she still existed, still fought. The image of the lion, majestic and protective, who had offered shade and a brief respite of compassion, returned to her mind. If a wild animal could show such kindness, if nature could be so paradoxical, perhaps there was a reason for her to fight, even if it was just to defy her son's cruelty and the desert's indifference. The night's cold tightened its grip, freezing her bones, but the fever of fear and fury kept her in a state of painful alertness. Thirst was a burning ember in her throat, hunger a dull, constant ache. But the worst torture was the waiting, the certainty of being watched, evaluated as a piece of meat, her life hanging by a thin thread, about to be cut by sharp teeth. She could feel the warm, fetid breath of the jackals as they approached, their wild, dirty smells overpowering the clean, powerful aroma of the lion that still lingered in her memory, a brutal contrast between life and death. One of the jackals, the leader, stepped forward again, but this time with calculated slowness, its eyes fixed on hers, as if trying to decipher the mystery of her resistance. It approached her chained hand, not to bite, but to sniff, to inspect the chain, the sand around it. It was a display of power, a cruel reminder of her helplessness. The woman held her breath, each heartbeat echoing in her ears, a frantic drum against her ribs. She could feel the ground tremble under the animal's light weight, the vibration of its quick, shallow breaths. In an act of desperation, the woman tried to move her legs, dragging her heels in the sand, a useless movement that only raised a small cloud of dust. The sound of the chains dragging, a metallic hiss, broke the tension for an instant, but the jackals merely watched, their eyes gleaming. She tried to kick, but the chains prevented her, limiting her movements to painful spasms. The fury that had driven her to roar now mingled with despair, a bitter mixture that made her tremble uncontrollably. The pack leader, as if tired of waiting, took a bold step. It approached her barefoot, one of the few exposed spots not covered by her torn clothes. Its pink, moist tongue brushed her cold skin, a damp, chilling touch that made her shrink back despite the chains. It was not a bite, but a provocation, a test, an anticipation. She felt the warmth of its body, its fetid breath, the promise of imminent pain. Primordial terror returned with full force, colder and more penetrating than the night air itself. She closed her eyes, but the images of teeth and claws were already etched in her mind. Where was the lion now, that unexpected guardian, who had offered shade and a brief respite of compassion? He had left, taking hope with him, leaving her at the mercy of the true face of the night desert. Her son's cruelty, who had chained her under the sun to die of heat, now seemed an anticipation of nature's cruelty, which delivered her to its scavengers. The irony was a poison that mingled with her blood, but also a strange force that kept her from giving up completely. If an animal could show such compassion, perhaps there was a reason for her to fight, even if it was just to defy the death that surrounded her. She opened her eyes again, fixing her gaze on the jackal that was so close. There was no more fear in her eyes, only a cold, desperate determination. She would not die like this. She would not be consumed by these scavengers, not after having been saved by the king of the desert. The jackal, perceiving the change in her gaze, recoiled slightly, a low growl escaping its throat. That was not the gaze of a dying prey. It was the gaze of a fighter, of someone who, even chained and on the verge of death, refused to surrender. The night was long, and the demons of the desert still surrounded her, sniffing out death, waiting. But the woman, chained and on the verge of death, had found a voice, a last remnant of dignity. The battle for survival was far from over, and the desert in its brutal indifference watched. Hope, Though fragile as the sand beneath her feet had not been extinguished, she trembled with cold, with pain, with fear, but also with a new and strange determination. The night desert was a realm of predators, but she, for a brief moment, had refused to be merely prey. She had no way to fight, but she had a way not to surrender, and that, in itself, was a victory. The refusal to surrender was a fragile but stubborn flame, burning against the cutting cold of the night desert. The woman, chained and exhausted, felt the weight of every minute. The icy sand sucking the warmth from her body, her aching muscles crying out for rest. But rest would not come. Not while the hungry eyes of the jackals watched her, not while the pack leader, with its calculated audacity, continued to test the limits of her endurance. The jackal's low growl, after its damp, chilling touch, was a constant reminder of her vulnerability. It had not bitten, not yet. But the provocation was clear, the promise of imminent pain, a cruel game unfolding under the pale moonlight. The other jackals, emboldened by the leader's daring, tightened the circle, their lean, furry bodies moving like shadows, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that transcended the simple need for food. It was a hunger for weakness, for surrender. The woman closed her eyes for an instant, trying to push away the image of sharp teeth, the fetid smell that intensified with each approach. But there was no escape. The darkness behind her eyelids was as menacing as the darkness that surrounded her. She reopened her eyes, fixing her gaze on the lead jackal, not with fear, but with a silent fury, an icy determination that surprised her. If it wanted a fight, she would give it one, even if it was only with her gaze, with her refusal to look away. The jackal, perceiving the change in her eyes, recoiled slightly, a deeper growl escaping its throat. That was not the gaze of a dying prey. It was the gaze of a fighter, of someone who, even chained and on the verge of death, refused to surrender. But hunger was a powerful force, and the animal's surprise was momentary. They were accustomed to prey that yielded, that accepted its fate. This challenge was an anomaly. The leader, with a quick and unexpected movement, made a small leap, not to attack, but to position itself even closer, almost touching her knee. It sniffed, a hissing sound coming from its nostrils, and then, with terrifying speed, bit the tip of her big toe. It was not a deep bite, but enough to pierce the skin, for a drop of dark blood to well up, staining the sand. The pain was sharp, searing, an electric shock that ran through her already exhausted body. A whimper escaped her lips, but she stifled it, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream. The bite was a warning, a brutal reminder of her helplessness. The smell of her own blood, warm and metallic, mingled with the dry air, and the jackals reacted. Their growls intensified, a chorus of excitement and anticipation. They approached even closer, their bodies brushing against each other, impatience growing in their eyes. The woman felt the warmth of their bodies, their fetid breath, the promise of even greater pain. Primordial terror returned with full force, colder and more penetrating than the night air itself. She closed her eyes again, but the images of teeth and claws were already etched in her mind. Where was the lion now? That unexpected guardian who had offered shade and a brief respite of compassion. He had left, taking hope with him, leaving her at the mercy of the true face of the night desert. Her son's cruelty, who had chained her under the sun to die of heat, now seemed an anticipation of nature's cruelty, which delivered her to its scavengers. The irony was a poison that mingled with her blood, but also a strange force that kept her from giving up completely. If an animal could show such compassion, perhaps there was a reason for her to fight, even if it was just to defy the death that surrounded her. She opened her eyes again, fixing her gaze on the jackal that was so close. There was no more fear in her eyes, only a cold, desperate determination. She would not die like this. She would not be consumed by these scavengers, not after having been saved by the king of the desert. Suddenly, a sound, not a jackal's growl, but something deeper, more resonant, that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. A subtle tremor ran through the ground, and the jackals who had been so confident froze. Their growls ceased abruptly, replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the whistling wind. Their ears perked up, swiveling in all directions. Their eyes, previously fixed on the woman, now swept the darkness with new apprehension. The pack leader let out a low, almost inaudible whimper and recoiled a step, then another, its movements now hesitant, cautious. The other jackals followed suit, breaking the circle, their bodies shrinking, their tails between their legs. The air grew heavy, laden with a new presence, a smell that was not that of a jackal, but something more powerful, more ancient. A smell of earth, of sun, of indomitable strength. The woman, feeling the abrupt change in the atmosphere, opened her eyes. The jackals were visibly terrified, their dark forms huddled together. Trembling, they were not looking at her, they were looking into the darkness beyond her, at the source of that sound, that smell. A deep, unmistakable growl echoed again, closer this time, making the sand vibrate beneath her body. It was the sound of the king. The lion had returned. The sound, it was not just a growl, but a roar that seemed to tear the veil of night. A primordial symphony of power and dominance that echoed in the depths of the desert. The sand beneath the woman's body vibrated, a visceral response to that ancestral call. The jackals, previously so audacious in their hunger, were seized by paralyzing terror. The leader's low whimper transformed into a muffled lament, and its movements, previously calculated, became frantic. The circle broke in an instant, each animal seeking its own salvation, their dark forms dissolving into the darkness like frightened ghosts. There was no chase, no battle, only the presence, the smell, the sound. The king had returned, and his mere existence was a decree of banishment for the scavengers. The woman, with her eyes fixed in the direction from which the sound came, felt a wave of relief so overwhelming that it almost made her faint. It was a strange, almost insane sensation to be saved by a predator from other predators. Her heart, which had previously pounded with fear, now raced with a mixture of gratitude and a new apprehension. The lion. He was back, but why, and what would he do now? From the shadows, a majestic form began to materialize. It was not a hurried blur, but a slow and deliberate apparition, each step measured, each movement exuding unquestionable authority. The pale moonlight silvered its mane, transforming it into an imposing silhouette against the starry backdrop. Its eyes, two bright amber points, swept the scene, fixing on the dark figures that scurried away. And then, with calculated slowness, on the chained woman. The lion did not rush. It walked to where the jackals had gathered, sniffed the air for a brief moment, as if confirming the cowardice of its lesser rivals, and then, with a dignity that bordered on defiance, turned to her. The woman held her breath. The pain in her big toe, where the jackal had bitten, seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of that moment. The smell of her own blood, which had previously attracted death, now seemed to have conjured a guardian. It approached, not with the aggression of a predator, but with the thoughtful curiosity of an observer. With each step, the ground trembled slightly. She could see the powerful muscles contracting under the golden hide, the brute force contained in every fiber of its being. When it was a few feet away, it stopped. Its eyes studied her, deep and unfathomable, as if searching for an answer to an enigma only it knew. There was no hunger in its gaze, only an intensity that made her feel completely exposed, yet strangely safe. Then, with a sigh that seemed to move the very air, the lion lay down, not just anyhow, but positioning itself so that its massive body formed a barrier between her and the vast, menacing night desert. Its soft mane brushed the sand, and the warmth of its body began to radiate, a welcome balm against the biting cold that was consuming her. She felt the slow, powerful rhythm of its breathing, a constant, reassuring sound that filled the silence the jackals had left behind. The woman closed her eyes, allowing a solitary tear to trickle down her temple. It was a tear of pain, of exhaustion, but also of incomprehensible gratitude. Her son, the one she had loved and nurtured, had condemned her to the cruelest death. And now, a wild animal, a predator by nature, offered her shade under the sun and protection against the demons of the night. The irony was a bitter blow, but also a source of strength. If compassion could exist in such a wild heart, perhaps there was a reason for her to fight, not to surrender to the darkness that surrounded her. She opened her eyes again, watching the lion. It lay there, but alert, its ears swiveling slightly, its eyes fixed on the darkness, guarding her. The smell of earth, sun, and indomitable strength that emanated from it was no longer threatening, but a mantle of security. The bite on her foot still hurt, but the physical pain was overshadowed by the wonder and mystery of that moment. The night continued, and the lion remained. Its presence was a silent promise, a shield against the invisible horrors lurking in the shadows. The woman, chained and on the verge of death, found unexpected refuge in the arms of the wildest nature. She was still trapped, still hungry and thirsty, and the desert's cold still tried to steal her life. But for now she was not alone. She had a guardian, a king of the desert who, for some inexplicable reason, had chosen to protect her. And that protection, however temporary, was all she needed to rekindle the fragile flame of her determination. The battle for survival was far from over, but now she had an ally. An ally that defied all logic and all the cruelty that had led her there. The night dragged on, a heavy, cold veil over the desert. But under the lion's protection, the cold seemed less biting, the darkness less menacing. The slow, powerful rhythm of the animal's breathing was a constant mantra, a sound that filled the void left by the jackal's silence. The woman felt the heat radiating from the lion's massive body, a vital warmth that fought the icy air trying to steal her last spark of life. Her eyes, previously fixed on the dark horizon, now closed and opened at irregular intervals, observing the imposing silhouette beside her. The soft mane which brushed the sand seemed like a pillow for the king of the desert, a king who, for some unfathomable reason, had chosen to be her guardian. The pain in her big toe, where the jackal had bitten, throbbed with a dull intensity, but it was a pain she could bear, a pain that reminded her she was still alive. The smell of her own blood, now dry, mingled with the wild aroma of the lion, earth, sun, and an indomitable force that was no longer threatening, but a mantle of security. It was a cruel and beautiful irony. The son she had loved and nurtured had condemned her to the vilest death, and now a predator, a wild animal, offered her shade under the sun and protection against the demons of the night. This irony was a poison, yes, but also a strange source of strength, a reason to fight. The stars began to fade one by one as darkness gave way to a pale gray in the east. The horizon, previously an indistinct line, began to gain contours, revealing the undulating dunes and jagged rocks that dotted the landscape. The desert, which during the night was a realm of invisible hunters, prepared to transform again into a relentless furnace under the sun. The woman felt a shiver run through her body, not just from the cold that intensified before dawn, but from the anticipation of the light, of that heat that just hours before had been her tormentor. The lion remained motionless, a golden statue against the brightening sky. Its amber eyes, however, were open, fixed on the horizon, as if it too were aware of the imminent change. Its ears swiveled slightly, catching the first sounds of the waking desert, the distant rustle of a dry bush, the chirp of a solitary bird. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent expectation that hung between the woman and her protector. What would happen when the sun returned in its full fury? Would the lion stay, Or was its compassion merely a nocturnal whim, an anomaly in the desert's brutality? The first rays of sun appeared, thin spears of golden light piercing the pale sky, painting the sparse clouds with shades of pink and orange. The heat, still weak, began to spread, dispelling the last remnant of the night's cold. The woman felt the skin of her face, already burned and parched, begin to tingle with the promise of the torment to come. She watched the lion, her heart beating with a mixture of dread and an almost insane hope. Then, with a deliberate slowness that seemed to defy the very passage of time, the lion moved. It did not rise to leave, nor to hunt. Instead, it adjusted its position. With a low, guttural grunt, it rose slightly on its front paws, rotated its massive body, and lay down again, this time facing the rising sun. Its majestic mane and imposing body formed a perfect barrier, a living shield that blocked the first sunbeams attempting to reach the woman. The shadow it cast over her was an oasis of relief, a tangible reminder of its silent promise. The woman closed her eyes, feeling the immediate difference. The heat that had previously threatened to consume her was now a gentle breeze at the edge of the shadow. A tear trickled down her temple, not from pain, but from a gratitude so profound it could barely be contained. It was a miracle, an act of compassion that defied all logic, all the cruelty that had led her there. Her son, the man she had raised, had abandoned her to die. And a lion, the wild king of the desert, was there, protecting her. Thirst was a constant agony, a rough scraping in her throat that made every breath a torture. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but the lion's presence, the shadow it offered, was sustenance for her exhausted soul. She watched the lion's golden mane shimmer in the sunlight, desert flies beginning to buzz around, but the lion ignored them, its eyes fixed on the horizon, guarding her. The battle for survival was far from over. She was still chained, still hungry and thirsty, and the desert, in its brutal indifference, continued to watch her. But now she had an ally, an unexpected guardian who defied all logic and all cruelty. Her determination, previously a fragile flame, now burned with renewed intensity. She would not die there, not after having been saved by the king of the desert. She would fight not for revenge, but for her own dignity, for her own life, which a wild animal had taught her to value again. The desert had tried to claim her, but the king of the desert had intervened, and the lion, in its silent majesty, was proof that, even in the most brutal of landscapes, compassion could find a home. The sun climbed to its zenith, a flaming, merciless eye in the vast, empty firmament. Even within the precious circle of shadow the lion cast, the heat was a burden, an oppressive presence that sucked the moisture from every pore of her body. The surrounding sand shimmered with blinding intensity, and the air quivered above her, distorting the landscape into ghostly mirages that danced on the horizon line. The woman felt her skin stretch and crack, her throat so dry it felt sanded from within. Each breath was an effort, a painful rasp that promised more agony with every inhale. But she was not in direct sunlight. The lion's golden mane, now a flaming halo against the relentless blue, was her only refuge, an oasis of relief in an inferno of light. She watched the lion. Its eyes, still fixed on the horizon, held a depth she could not fathom. There was no sign of discomfort, no restless movement, only an ancient, stoic patience. How could such a creature, a symbol of raw power and wild instinct, display such a selfless act of protection? It defied every lesson she had learned about the world, every bitter truth her son had hammered into her heart. The memory of her son, Daniel, surfaced with piercing clarity. His face, once so innocent, now distorted by greed and indifference. The cold, a calculating glint in his eyes as he tightened the chains on her wrists. "You cost me too much, Mother," he had said, words sharper than any blade. "It's time for you to pay your debt." The debt? What debt could justify such barbarity? She had given him everything, her unconditional love, her time, her fortune, and he, in return, had given her the desert and the promise of a slow, agonizing death. The contrast was of physical pain. Daniel, her own blood, had condemned her. The lion, a stranger, a predator by nature, was saving her. It was an irony that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time, a hysterical laugh her parched throat would not allow, a tearless cry that burned within. Compassion, she realized, was not an exclusive human trait. Perhaps, she thought with a pang of bitterness, it was even purer and more instinctive in an animal, devoid of the complexities and corruptions that stained the human heart. The sun continued its relentless climb, then began its slow descent. The lion, with subtle, almost imperceptible movements, adjusted its massive body. A slight shift of a paw, a gentle turn of its head, ensuring that the precious shadow remained precisely where it was needed, shielding her from the direct assault of the solar furnace. It was a dance of silent devotion, a testament to a bond forged in the crucible of despair. The wound on her big toe throbbed, a constant reminder of the night's terror. She could feel the heat radiating from the sand, even through the thin fabric of her clothes. Her lips were cracked, her tongue swollen. Hunger was a hollow ache, but thirst was primordial, a burning hell that threatened to consume her from within. Yet, she resisted. The lion was her anchor, her reason to persist. If he could endure the heat and immobility for her, she could endure the pain and deprivation. Hours slipped away, marked only by the changing angle of the sun and the gradual lengthening of the shadow. The desert was alive with its own silent symphony of heat and survival. Distant vultures circled, mere specks against the vastness, their presence a grim reminder of her precarious situation. But they dared not approach. The king of the desert was on guard. She closed her eyes, trying to conserve what little energy she had left. The image of the lion, its golden mane shimmering, its powerful form a bulwark against the elements, was etched in her mind. It was a vision of wild grace, of unexpected mercy. She had faced death many times in her life, the death of dreams, the death of trust, the death of her own spirit at the hands of her son. But this was different. This was a physical confrontation with the end, and yet she was not alone. A faint breeze stirred, bringing with it the smell of dry earth and the subtle musk of the lion. It was an aroma that, in normal circumstances, would have signaled danger, primordial fear, but now it was a comfort, a promise of protection. She felt a strange sense of peace, a surrender not to death, but to the moment, to the inexplicable bond she shared with that magnificent creature. The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the dunes. The golden light softened, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The intensity of the heat began to diminish, replaced by a gradual cooling that promised the return of the desert's icy night. The lion remained, a sentinel, its vigil unbroken. Her mind, though clouded by dehydration and exhaustion, was clearer than it had been in years. Stripped of all possessions, all status, all human connection except for the one who betrayed her, she found herself in the rawest, most fundamental state of existence. And in that state, she discovered a truth deeper than any wealth could buy, that life, in its purest form, was a gift, and compassion, even from the most improbable source, was its most precious currency. The battle was far from over, but she had survived the day, and with the lion by her side, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she could survive the night, and the next day, and the next. The desert had tried to claim her, but the king of the desert had intervened, and for now, that was enough. The last thread of golden light dissolved on the horizon, taking with it the sun's most intense fury, but leaving behind the promise of a new torment. the biting cold of the desert night. An icy breeze, a ghostly breath, began to sweep across the dunes, raising goosebumps on the woman's already battered skin. The relief from the diminishing heat was an ephemeral illusion, quickly replaced by an uncontrollable tremor that ran through her exhausted body. She watched the lion, its massive silhouette, once a shield against the solar fire, now seemed a bulwark against the encroaching cold. It did not move. Its eyes, which glowed with an amber brilliance in the growing gloom, remained fixed on the void, an unwavering sentinel. The smell of its fur, once a wild perfume, now seemed to exude a strange sensation of warmth, a primitive comfort against the invasion of ice. The temperature plummeted with brutal speed. Every muscle in her body, already sore and tense, began to contract in uncontrollable spasms. Her teeth chattered, a frantic rhythm that echoed the dread in her heart. Thirst, which had been a consuming fire during the day, transformed into a freezing agony, a rough scraping that seemed to solidify her throat. Hunger, previously a hollow ache, was now an emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. She tried to curl up, pulling her knees close to her chest, but the chains prevented any significant movement. The cold metal on her wrists and ankles seemed to suck the remaining warmth from her body, a cruel reminder of her imprisonment. The desert, in its brutal indifference, offered no truce. If the day burned her, the night froze her. It was a relentless cycle of torture. But the lion was there, and its presence, however inexplicable, was a miracle that defied the desert's own logic. She forced herself to look at it, seeking in its immobility a strength she did not possess. The mane, once golden, was now a dark, imposing mass against the starry sky that began to emerge, dotted with millions of distant lights. A sound, a distant howl, sharp and solitary, tore through the night's silence. It was the lament of a coyote, or perhaps a jackal, a voice that spoke of the vastness and cruelty of that world. The woman shivered, but the lion remained motionless. Not a muscle in its body trembled, no sign of alarm. It was the king, and the other predators of the desert knew their place. That howl, previously a threat, now seemed a warning to others, a recognition of the guardian's sovereignty. The woman's mind, though clouded by exhaustion and dehydration, began to wander. She thought of Daniel, her son. Where would he be now? In a soft bed, perhaps, in some luxurious oasis, counting his newfound fortune, without a single thought for the mother he had abandoned. His image, smiling with the same coldness with which he had chained her, was a poison that tried to corrode the hope the lion had rekindled. But she refused to give in to that bitterness, not now, not after having been saved. The lion's compassion was a powerful antidote to her son's cruelty. It was a lesson she would never forget, that true humanity, true goodness, could be found in the most unexpected places, and that evil could flourish even in the heart of one she loved. Hours dragged on, slow and endless. The cold intensified, penetrating to her bones. She felt the stiffness in her joints, the numbness in her limbs. Sleep was an unattainable luxury, a refuge that pain and fear denied her. But she was not alone. The lion, a colossal and silent shadow, was her only companion, her only comfort. In a moment of desperation, she tried to speak, but her throat was so dry that only a hoarse, painful whisper escaped. "Lion," she managed to murmur, the sound almost inaudible. The lion did not move, but she felt or imagined feeling a slight tremor in its mane, a subtle acknowledgement of her voice. It was enough. It was proof that he was there, that he heard her, that he protected her. The night advanced, and with it, the promise of a new dawn. The woman closed her eyes, trying to wrap herself in her protector's fur, seeking warmth in its mere proximity. She could feel the slow, powerful rhythm of its breathing, the warmth of its body radiating through the icy air. It was a connection so primary, so fundamental, that it transcended the barrier between species. She had survived the day, and now, with the lion by her side, she was surviving the night. Her determination, previously a fragile flame, was now a burning bonfire in her chest. She would not die there, not after having been chosen by a king. She would fight not for revenge, but for her own life, for the dignity that a wild animal had taught her to value again. The desert had tried to claim her, but the king of the desert had intervened, and for now that was enough. Dawn began to break, bringing with it not warmth, but the promise of a new cycle of trials, and perhaps a new miracle. Dawn began to break, bringing with it not warmth, but the promise of a new cycle of trials, and perhaps a new miracle. The horizon, previously a dark and cold line, began to bleed in shades of purple and gold, a spectacle of cruel beauty that announced the sun's return. The cold, which had deepened in the dead of night, still bit, but the woman could feel the change in the air, a subtle anticipation of the heat that would soon come. Her muscles were stiff, her bones ached with an intensity that made her question how much longer her body could endure. The lion, a majestic silhouette against the brightening sky, remained motionless. Its eyes, which had glowed like embers in the darkness, now reflected the first rays of light, maintaining its unwavering vigil. It was as if it knew, with ancestral wisdom, what the new day would bring. The woman watched it, seeking in its immobility a strength she felt slipping from her own hands. The smell of its fur, a mixture of earth, sun, and wildness, was the only tangible comfort amidst her misery. Then the sun emerged, not as a gentle dawn, but as a relentless disk of fire rapidly rising above the dunes, pouring golden light that in a few minutes would transform into scorching heat. The icy night breeze receded, replaced by air that already began to vibrate with the promise of a furnace. The woman closed her eyes for an instant, feeling the first sting of heat on her already battered skin. It was a brutal reminder that the truce had ended. With slow and deliberate movements, the lion began to adjust itself. There was no hurry, no hesitation, only an instinctive precision. It rotated its massive body, positioning itself to intercept the ascending rays of the sun, ensuring that its shadow, still long and distorted, fell precisely over the chained woman. It was a dance of silent devotion, repeating the ritual of the previous day, but now with renewed urgency, for the morning sun was the herald of the most intense torment. Every fiber of her being cried out for water. Her throat was so parched that swallowing was an agony, and her tongue felt like rough sandpaper inside her mouth. Hunger was a hollow, constant ache, but thirst was primordial, a torture that surpassed all others. The wound on her big toe throbbed with a dull, pulsating pain, and she could feel the swelling and warmth around it. Her lips were cracked and bled slightly. Exhaustion was a thick fog that threatened to swallow her consciousness, but she could not give in, not now. The lion was her anchor, her proof that life was still worth fighting for. If he could endure the heat, immobility, and deprivation for her, she could endure the pain and suffering. The compassion of that wild animal was a mirror to her son's cruelty, and in that contrast she found a strange strength. Daniel, her own blood, had abandoned her to death, while a beast protected her with its own life. The irony was a poison that paradoxically kept her alive. Hours dragged on, slow and endless, marked only by the relentless ascent of the sun and the subtle movement of the lion, which adjusted its position to maintain the perfect shadow. The desert was alive with its own symphony of heat and survival. The buzzing of insects, the rustling of sand under the rising breeze, the oppressive silence that followed. Vultures, distant specks in the infinite blue, began to circle again, their sinister silhouettes a constant reminder of life's fragility. But they dared not approach. The king of the desert was on guard, and his presence commanded respect, even from the reapers of death. The woman's mind, though clouded by dehydration and exhaustion, was clearer than it had been in years. Stripped of all possessions, all status, all human connection, except for the one who betrayed her, she found herself in the rawest and most fundamental state of existence, and in that state, she discovered a truth deeper than any wealth could buy, that life, in its purest form, was a gift, and compassion, even from the most improbable source, was its most precious currency. The battle was far from over. The sun was at its zenith and the heat was unbearable, but she had survived the night, and now, with the lion by her side, she was surviving the day. Her determination, previously a fragile flame, was now a burning bonfire in her chest. She would not die there, not after having been chosen by a king. She would fight, not for revenge, but for her own life, for the dignity that a wild animal had taught her to value again. The desert had tried to claim her, but the king of the desert had intervened, and for now that was enough. But the day was still long, and her strength diminished with each passing minute. But the day was still long, and her strength diminished with each passing minute. The sun, a relentless tyrant, seemed parked at the top of the sky, pouring its fury over the golden vastness. Each breath was an effort, each heartbeat a slow, heavy drum in her ears. The woman felt the heat penetrate her thin clothes, her skin, her bones. The lion's shadow was a sanctuary, but not a complete shield against the furnace that was the desert. The air around her shimmered, distorting the already surreal landscape, transforming distant dunes into waves of an illusory sea. Her mind, once a battlefield between bitterness and hope, was now an arid terrain where thoughts formed and dissolved like mirages. She saw Daniel, not the cruel man who had chained her, but the boy, with his bright eyes and easy laugh, running through the lavender fields of her childhood. The image was so vivid that she reached out, only to feel the rough, hot sand beneath her fingers. It was torture, this mixture of sweet memories with the brutal reality of his betrayal. Thirst was a constant pain, a burning throat that cried out for relief. She tried to moisten her lips with her tongue, but it was like rubbing two pieces of sandpaper together. The lion, her silent guardian, remained a mountain of flesh and muscle. Its eyes, previously vigilant, now seemed half-closed, perhaps in a state of rest, but its posture showed no relaxation. It was the stillness of a predator, always alert, always ready. The woman observed the small movements of its tail, a slow, rhythmic sway that was the only sign of active life in its massive body. The smell of its fur, once a comfort, now seemed more intense, almost suffocating in the stagnant hot air. But it was a smell of life, of strength, and she clung to it. The vultures, previously distant specks, now seemed bolder. Their shadows, small and dark, danced over the sand, a sinister omen. They circled in slow, patient spirals, waiting. They knew that life in the desert was ephemeral, and death a certainty. But the lion's presence kept them at a respectful distance. They dared not challenge the king, not openly. The woman felt their hungry gazes, a sensation of being hunted, even under the lion's protection. It was a constant reminder of her own vulnerability, of how close she was to the end. The pain in her big toe had transformed into a pulsating agony, each beat of her heart reverberating in the wound. She could feel the heat and stiffness spreading, a sign of infection that in her condition could be fatal. Exhaustion was a fog that tried to drag her into unconsciousness, into oblivion. But she resisted. She could not afford to sleep, not with vultures in the sky and the invisible threat of death lurking. She needed to remain conscious, however painful it was. In a moment of delirium, she thought she heard Daniel's voice, calling her, a sweet, regretful voice. She opened her eyes with a start, searching for him on the shimmering horizon. But there was nothing, only the endless dunes and the scorching sun. It was just thirst, hunger, exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. The bitterness which she had tried to suppress resurfaced with renewed force. How could he have done this? How could a son be so cruel, so devoid of humanity? The image of the lion, a wild animal offering her protection, contrasted so violently with the image of her son that the irony was almost unbearable. Hours dragged on, each minute an eternity. The sun began its slow descent, but the heat did not diminish. It seemed even more intense, a suffocating heat that refused to yield. The lion's shadow, once a refuge, now seemed smaller, more fragile, as the sun moved westward. It adjusted its position again, with the same instinctive precision, ensuring that its massive form continued to intercept the most direct rays. It was a gesture of devotion the woman would never have imagined. She tried to move her limbs, but they were stiff and sore. Her muscles protested, her bones creaked. She felt weakness setting in, energy draining from her body. Hope, which the lion had rekindled, was now a faint ember, threatened by an icy wind of despair. How much longer could she endure? A day? A night? The lion could protect her from the sun, but not from thirst, hunger, or the spreading infection. A distant sound, a low, guttural growl echoed across the desert. It was not the lion. It was a different sound, sharper, wilder. The lion, which seemed to be in a state of rest, raised its head, its eyes fixed on the horizon. Its ears moved, catching the sound the woman could barely discern. There was something out there, something the lion recognized as a threat. The tension in the air increased, palpable. The king of the desert was on guard, and that meant danger was near. The woman felt a shiver run down her spine, a primordial fear that made her forget her own pain and exhaustion for an instant. The day was ending, but the night promised to bring its own horrors. The sound. It was a hoarse lament, a primal call that cut through the heavy twilight air. It was not the majestic roar of the lion, nor the rustling of the sand. It was something more sinister, an echo of hunger and opportunism that infiltrated the soul. The woman, her senses already frayed, felt a shiver run down her spine, colder than any desert breeze. She tried to focus her blurred eyes, following the line of the lion's gaze. It was tense. Every muscle of its massive body seemed to contract beneath its golden hide. Its eyes, previously half closed in patient vigilance, were now fully open, pupils dilated, fixed on a distant point on the horizon that the woman still could not discern. Then they appeared. First, a lean, stumbling shadow, then another and another. Hyenas. Their ungainly but powerful silhouettes emerged from the growing gloom, moving with a strange mixture of caution and audacity. Their eyes gleamed with a ghostly green in the last remnant of sunlight, and their growls, which had previously seemed distant, were now a chilling chorus of cackles and grunts that seemed to mock life itself. They had caught the scent of weakness, of vulnerability, of an easy meal. They had sensed death hovering, and they came to claim their share. The lion let out a deep growl, a sound that vibrated in the ground and in the woman's chest, a guttural warning that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It was not an attacking roar, but a declaration of possession, a boundary that would not be crossed. It adjusted its position again, not for shade now, but to directly face the newcomers. Its mane, previously a shield against the sun, now seemed like a crown of thorns. Bristling in defiance, it was the king, and this was its domain, its protected one. The woman felt terror set in, a fear different from the one Daniel had instilled in her. This was the primordial fear of nature, of the relentless food chain. She was chained, defenseless, a piece of meat at the mercy of predators, but the lion was there. Its presence was a wall, a promise. She clung to that promise with the little strength she had left, the only thing that kept her from succumbing to panic. The hyenas formed a semicircle, their heads low, their bodies swaying from side to side. There were many of them, perhaps a dozen, and the hunger in their eyes was palpable, a wild flame that drove them. They knew that a solitary lion, even a dominant male, could be challenged, especially if the prey was easy and night was falling. They tested the limits, advancing a step, retreating two, their nervous cackles echoing in the silent vastness of the desert, a macabre symphony of anticipation. The lion remained motionless, a bronze statue under the darkening sky. Its eyes did not waver, fixed on every movement, every intention. It was the personification of strength and determination. The woman watched the scene, her breath caught in her throat. Every movement of the hyenas, every growl of the lion was a beat in her already weak heart. The pain in her big toe was a constant reminder of her own mortality. But the battle unfolding before her was a cruel and fascinating distraction, a fight for life that kept her strangely present. Darkness swallowed the last thread of light, and the temperature began to drop, but the air was still heavy with tension. The woman's vision slowly adapted to the gloom, and she could distinguish the dark forms of the hyenas, their eyes glowing like distant embers. They were growing bolder, their growls louder, more insistent. One of them, larger and more corpulent than the others, stepped forward, its head low, sniffing the air, challenging the king's authority. The lion did not wait. With a roar that tore through the night's silence, it stepped forward, a quick and powerful movement that sent sand flying. The hyena recoiled with a startled yelp, and the rest of the pack dispersed for an instant, only to quickly regroup. They were persistent, hungry. They would not give up easily. The lesson had been learned, but hunger was still stronger. The woman felt a wave of adrenaline mixed with deep exhaustion. She was witnessing a battle for survival, and she was the prize. The irony was overwhelming. Her son had thrown her to the vultures, and now the reapers of the night were coming for her. But a wild king was willing to die to protect her. The gratitude she felt for the lion was as overwhelming as the bitterness she felt for Daniel. The night advanced, and with it the threat became more tangible. The hyenas began to circle closer, their movements more coordinated. They were trying to flank the lion, seeking an opening, a weakness. The lion turned slowly, always keeping them in its field of vision, its tail lashing the air in a constant rhythm. It was a deadly dance, a ballet of predators under the crescent moon, where every step could mean life or death. The woman closed her eyes for an instant, trying to conserve energy. She could smell the hyenas now, a pungent, wild odor that mingled with the lion's musk. It was the smell of life and death, intertwined in the desert. She wondered if the lion could hold out. He was alone, and they were many. Their hunger was a powerful force, and hers diminished with each passing minute. Suddenly, an abrupt movement. A younger, more impetuous hyena tried to sneak behind the lion. But the king was swift, a turn of its body, a furious growl, and the hyena was repelled with a paw strike that sent it rolling in the sand. It got up limping but did not give up. The lesson had been learned, but hunger was still stronger. The woman felt the night's cold penetrate her bones, but the heat of the battle kept her strangely alert. She was no longer just a victim, she was a witness, an integral part of that struggle. Her life depended on the lion, and somehow she felt that his honor depended on her too. He had chosen her. He was protecting her. She could not give in. The lion let out another roar, more prolonged this time, a call that seemed to echo across the endless dunes. It was a sound of defiance, of power, but also of tiredness. He was fighting against thirst, hunger, and exhaustion, just like her. But he showed no signs of weakness. He was the guardian, the protector. The hyenas recoiled a little, respecting the warning, but did not move away. They were patient. They knew the night was long, and the lion, however majestic, could not fight forever. The woman felt despair seep in again, a cold wave that threatened to extinguish the ember of hope. The night was just beginning, and the battle for her life was far from over. She could feel the hungry eyes of the hyenas and knew they would wait until the last breath, hers or the lion's. The tension was a rope stretched to its maximum, ready to snap at any moment. The tension was a rope stretched to its maximum, ready to snap at any moment. The night, which should have brought some relief from the infernal heat, now brought a biting cold and dense darkness, only punctuated by the treacherous gleam of the hyena's eyes. They were ghostly shadows, moving in a macabre ballet around the lion, their growls and cackles forming a symphony of threat that pierced the desert silence. The woman, huddled against the cold sand, felt every fiber of her body protest. The pain in her big toe pulsed with an intensity that seemed to want to consume her consciousness. Thirst was sandpaper in her throat, and hunger an empty hole in her stomach. But however much her body cried out for surrender, her mind was fixated on the scene before her, a primordial battle for her very existence. The lion, a fortress of muscle and fur, turned slowly, its golden eyes sweeping the circle of predators. It was the personification of vigilance, every movement calculated, every growl a warning. But the woman could feel exhaustion seeping into him too. The fight against the sun, hunger, thirst, and now the hyena pack. It was too much for any creature, even a king. The hyenas, cunning and relentless, knew this. They did not attack head-on. They tested, provoked, seeking the slightest flaw, the slightest hesitation. One of them, more audacious, attempted a quick lunge from the side, a dark blur that darted towards the woman. The lion reacted with surprising speed, a roar that tore through the night and a paw strike that sent the hyena yelping and recoiling, stumbling. But the distraction was enough. While the lion dealt with the first, two other hyenas tried to sneak up from behind, aiming for the easy, defenseless prey. The woman's heart pounded, a frantic drum in her chest. She could feel the fetid breath of one of them, the smell of carrion and earth, the proximity of death. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact, the tearing of flesh. But it did not come. The lion, with an impossible turn, intercepted the second hyena with a sideways swipe, knocking it down. The third, startled by the king's fury, retreated in time. He was a tireless warrior, but with each lunge, each defense, the woman saw a flicker of tiredness in his eyes, an almost imperceptible tremor in his paws. Was he wounded? She could not see in the darkness, but the intensity of the battle was taking its toll. "Hold on, my king," she whispered, her voice a mere thread of sound. "Hold on." The irony of the situation struck her with the force of lightning. Her son, Daniel, the man she had loved and raised, had abandoned her to die, and a wild animal, a predator by nature, was risking its own life to protect her. Her son's love had turned to poison, and nature's ferocity had become a shield. What did this say about humanity? What did it say about her? The hyenas regrouped, their cackles louder, more coordinated. They were communicating, devising a new strategy. The woman could feel the cruel intelligence behind their movements. They were not just hungry animals, they were experienced hunters, and they knew that persistence was their greatest weapon. The lion let out a prolonged roar, a sound that seemed to come from its gut, a final warning, a declaration that it would not yield. The earth vibrated beneath the sound, and the hyenas recoiled for an instant, respecting the primordial force of that sound. But not for long. Hunger was a more powerful engine than fear. They began to circle again, faster this time, a whirlwind of shadows and gleaming eyes. The lion turned with them, its eyes fixed, its tail lashing the air like a metronome of death. The woman felt the night's cold penetrate her bones, but the adrenaline kept her heart beating, her senses sharp. She could hear the dragging of paws in the sand, the rustling of their fur, the clicking of their teeth. Suddenly, the lead hyena, the largest and most corpulent, made an unexpected move. Instead of attacking, it dropped to the ground, crawling, trying to slip under the lion's line of sight, straight for the woman. It was a dirty, desperate tactic. The lion saw it, but was committed to the others, advancing in a feigned attack. He had to choose, protect himself or protect the woman. Without hesitation, the lion threw itself backward, exposing its flank to an attack, but intercepting the crawling hyena with a massive paw. The hyena yelped in pain and surprise, rolling away. But the cost was high. One of the hyenas, feigning the attack, seized the opening and bit the lion's hind leg, a quick, painful strike. The lion let out a roar of pain and fury, a sound that chilled the woman to the bone. He turned, ignoring the wound, and charged the hyena that had bitten him, throwing it away with brutal force. But the message was clear. He was wounded. Blood, dark in the dim light, began to stain the sand. The hyenas smelled it, the smell of fresh blood, the smell of weakness. Their cackles became sharper, more triumphant. They knew they had found an opening. The woman felt despair set in again, deeper this time. The lion, her protector, was wounded. How much longer could he hold out? The night was still young and the pack relentless. The rope was stretched to its maximum, and now it began to fray. The smell of fresh blood, a sign of weakness, was an intoxicating perfume for the hyenas. Their cackles grew sharper, more triumphant, a macabre chorus celebrating the king's wound. The rope was stretched to its limit, and now it began to fray. The woman felt despair settle in again, deeper this time. The lion, her protector, was wounded. How much longer could he hold out? The night was still young and the pack relentless. Shadows danced around them, each a hungry predator, their eyes gleaming with ancestral malice. The lion, despite the evident pain in its hind leg, did not yield. It turned slowly, always keeping the woman behind it, a living shield against imminent death. Blood flowed from its wound, mingling with the sand, a dark trail that the hyenas followed with renewed eagerness. They did not attack all at once, but in waves, testing the lion's endurance, seeking exhaustion, the moment when pain would make it falter. One hyena tried to sneak around one side, while another, bolder, charged directly. The lion growled, a guttural sound that seemed to tear through the darkness, and with a swift swipe of its front paw, repelled the approaching one. But the distraction allowed the first to get dangerously close to the woman. She felt the cold, vetted air of the hyena on her face, panic rising in her throat. She tried to scream, but her voice was only a hoarse whisper. The lion, sensing the danger, turned with surprising agility for a wounded animal, intercepting the hyena with a sideways lunge that sent it flying. He was a warrior, a king, but with each movement, each defense, the woman saw the tension in his muscles, the tremor in his wounded paw. He was fighting not only for her life, but for his own, and with each passing second, the scales tipped further towards the pack. "Please, hold on," she silently pleaded, her tears mingling with the dust and sweat on her face. "My king, hold on." The irony was a poison in her veins. Daniel, her son, had abandoned her to a slow, agonizing death. This animal, wild and untamed, was offering its life to protect her. Human love, which she believed to be unconditional, had revealed itself to be a cruel illusion, while nature's ferocity, which she had always feared, had transformed into a shield of loyalty. What did this say about humanity? What did it say about love? With a final roar, a primal scream that came from the depths of its wild soul, the lion lunged. It was not a calculated attack, but an explosion of fury and desperation. It charged the lead hyena, which had recovered and was about to bite its wounded paw again. The impact was brutal. The lion struck it with its full mass, knocking it down and sinking its fangs into its neck. The hyena yelped, a strangled sound of pain and terror, as the lion violently shook it. It was a display of strength, a final warning. The leader's life was in its paws. The other hyenas, which had previously seemed invincible in their numbers, hesitated. The smell of their own leader's blood, the sound of its suffering, broke the pack's coordination. They recoiled a step, then another, their eyes still hungry, but now mixed with a new fear. The lion released them, the lead hyena falling to the sand, gasping and severely wounded. He did not kill it, but the message was clear. He could. With a final growl, the lion turned to the remaining hyenas. He was limping, his hind leg bleeding profusely, but his golden eyes shone with unwavering determination. The pack finally yielded. With yelps of frustration and defeat, they turned and ran into the darkness, their shadows quickly disappearing among the dunes. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the lion's heavy breathing and the woman's frantic heartbeat. She watched as the lion, exhausted, limped back to her. He lay down heavily beside her, his body warm and wounded, but still there. He had won. He had protected her. The woman reached out a trembling hand, ignoring the pain in her body, and touched the lion's rough fur. He purred softly, a sound that vibrated through her body, a melody of relief and gratitude. She felt his blood on her hand, warm and sticky, and a new wave of tears rolled down her face. They were not tears of fear, but of a deep and overwhelming emotion. Night began to give way to dawn. A thin line of orange light appeared on the horizon, announcing the sun's return. The lion, her protector, was still there, but his body was heavy, his breathing shallow. He had fulfilled his silent promise. He had fought to the last breath of his strength. She looked at the desert that stretched infinitely, now illuminated by the cold light of dawn. She was alive for now. The sun, which had once been her executioner, now seemed a silent observer. Daniel had condemned her, but a wild king had redeemed her. The lesson was clear, etched into her soul with the ferocity of battle and the loyalty of an animal. Love, she realized, was not a guarantee of goodness, and nature not always a threat. Sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources, and true humanity could be found in the heart of a beast. She closed her eyes, her face turned towards the rising sun, feeling its warmth on her skin. The lion beside her gave a last, faint purr, and then its body relaxed. The woman did not know what the day would bring, whether thirst or heat would take her, or if help would come. But she knew she was no longer alone. She had found a love and loyalty that her own son could never offer, and for that she would be eternally grateful. The rope that bound her to the sand was still there, but the rope that bound her to life and to hope had been strengthened by the sacrifice of a king.